Next question: does does Social Security look at declining earnings to help make a decision, like going from $60,000 per year to 40,000, and then the last year worked 20,000 after working 25 years at the same job? And do they look at attendance?
Fantastic question. And I am very pleased to tell you, yes, they do consider that. There's actually a law, and I can't cite it because it's a court case law, so I don't remember it offhand. But there is a law in Social Security that if somebody's making, bank, if they're doing really, really well, and then you see the years start dwindling, and then the year they become disabled, their earnings have gone down 90%,
Yep.
and then they're just not working at all. Do they consider that? Absolutely. That is so indicative of not just a disabled person, but a disabled person who was busting their bucket to just kind of stay in the workforce. So yes, they do. And the reason is this, to get a disability check is a fraction of what you're earning. Okay, your earnings are always going to be, multiples of your disability check, and that's the way that it was designed back in 1935 when Social Security was created. It was designed. It's going to be a fraction. If you get a check for retirement, it's going to be a fraction of what your earnings were. If you get a disability check, it's going to be a fraction of what your earnings were. And the law is based on this. No reasonable person is going to go from $80,000 a year to a disability check, unless they're disabled. No reasonable person would do that. You don't walk away from money. Reasonable people don't do that. That's indicative of disability. So yeah, great question. But my happy answer is it's very logical, and they do look at that.
How do they look at it logistically? Like, is it going to come up on the earnings report and then they just look at it that way? Or when we're filing a case, do we actually need to put in a note about declining earnings? Or are they just going to end up finding that?
The only time that we would really get involved and would want to do some serious research is if their onset was a year ago, but they tell me I had to leave a year ago. Okay, did it just was there a trauma that there's you were earning this much, you had to quit? Oh, no, Mr. Groves, I was earning this much, and then I had to cut my hours. And well, when did you cut your hours? And that can actually be something that affects your onset date, because once you cut your hours and you get below the SGA level, you get below to where Social Security finds you gainfully employed, and there is a level there. That can be your onset. It doesn't have to be the day that you actually left. I'm not making anything now. Okay, well, what were you making before then? I was working like 20 hours a week. Oh, okay. Well, how much were you making an hour? And they tell you, and I'll do some math, and you were below the limit. When did that happen? Well, that happened about 6 months earlier. Okay, well, that's probably your onset date. That's when you became disabled. The mechanics of that would be your pay stubs. Just a quick, I'll go as quick as I can, a quick education on the way Social Security sees earnings. How do they get them? They get them from the IRS. And so if you've reported, $80,000 in 2023, and then all of a sudden it's, $55,000 in 2024, and then it goes down to like $8,000 in 2025. And you were to say, I became disabled in, September of 2025. Well, that makes sense. Okay, you had some earnings, but, later in that year, you became disabled. So and that's how they see it. They see it in two ways. They see it at yearly report from the IRS, and then quarterly reports, which I believe also comes from the IRS, and it'll actually show which quarter you had earnings in. Yeah. And if you you had no earnings in like the last quarter of 2020, in my example, last quarter of 2025, that makes sense that, okay. And sometimes you have some lag earnings, like if they owe you for leave, or there's some kind of I don't know, disability package, long-term disability. They were paying you a portion of your salary. Were you working? No. Well, then you weren't employed, and that can actually be part of your disability. So yeah, that's a great question. But that is how they look at it. They get these queries, is what they call them, and there's really two of them. There's a summary, a SEQI, which is basically a summary of the query, earnings query, and it basically is years. And then they have the DQI, and that's detailed earning query.
Sounds like a Star Wars
Yeah,
character.
DQI, yeah. And the DQI, actually, when you read it, it's pages long. You worked for Target, this is how much you made at Target, and you worked at, Walmart, and this is how much you made at Walmart. It actually has the details of those earnings. So that's my long answer to your another short question.
Yeah, I see it pop up all the time where I ask a client, when's the last time you worked? And they'll say, February of this year. And my follow-up question is, did you work pretty consistently up until that point? And then they'll say, well, no, I tried to go back to work in February. And then it turns out that they were working full-time up until October.
Right.
And then they were out a month. They were out of work for 4 months, and they went back in February for like a week or two.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, then we're not going to say that you became disabled in February if you've been out of work full-time since October.
And it is in their best interest. And, of course, because our fee comes from their back pay, it's in our best interest to give you the most favorable onset. And we see that happen all the time. When did you become disabled? Well, in February. Okay, just stopped working in February? No, I really haven't worked since October. Well, they were paying me. I had leave, and I was working a day a week. When did you stop making this amount of money? Oh, that was probably October. Okay, all right. That's when your onset date is. And so if you're ever wondering why we're so consumed with that, is it makes a big difference on your back pay. Mm-hmm. And it makes a big difference on when you're going to be eligible for Medicare if it's a SSDI case. There's that waiting period, and then for Medicare, you have to be disabled for 24 months plus the 5-month waiting period. So you have to be disabled for 29 months. If I can get the onset back, 5, 6, 7, 8 months, it can make a really big difference in when you're actually getting medical coverage.
Yeah. Okay, good. If you have a question about your disability case, give us a call at 615-453-9151 Monday through Friday, or click the link in the description of this video.